Certainly a huge pleasure to be here today to tell you about a group that we started in Pfizer some 5-6 years ago. A group where we're focused on a very unique type of collaborative model, working with key academic institutions, with government agencies, with patient foundations and patient advocacy groups. With really the view that potentially together we could accelerate and translate new areas of emerging science from the academic community, leverage what I certainly believe Big Pharma does really well, and that's drug discovery, but bringing together teams of individuals with complementary expertise that share the same common goal to see new science translated into the clinic. I guess the first couple of slides that I'd just like to share probably are no big surprise to really anybody in the room. But I think just to set the stage of why we reflected we needed to build a different type of organization was really based on many of the challenges that we all appreciate, whether it's in the biotech community or indeed in large pharma, is really the challenge of drug discovery. How do we identify those new areas of science? We invest probably almost $2 billion with many, many failures on the way, from the initial concept through screening, whether that's with medicinal chemistry approaches or engineering proteins, to be able to move those drugs into clinical trials. Those of us who spend a little bit of time thinking about how do we move a new molecular entity into the clinic, I think also appreciate the huge challenges there are to efficiently execute in the clinic, identifying the right patient populations, moving from that area of blockbusters to more targeted therapies. I think we all share that excitement in the rare disease space. I'm sure we'll hear a lot more about gene therapy and rare populations. And can we learn anything from understanding some of the molecular mechanisms that drive and are the key pathogenic mechanisms underlying some of these rare extreme phenotypes that may have implications in broader disease populations? You know, this slide is a little bit out of date, and maybe the last 3 or 4 years have been somewhat more encouraging than the last 2 decades. But again, I think we're all very familiar with the significant productivity issues that the industry has faced really over the last 10, 20 years, in part because of the regulatory environment somewhat more complex than in years previous. Some of the clinical trials, as we alluded to, are longer, they're more complicated. One of the huge changes, of course, has been the interface with reimbursement agencies and the challenges associated therein. But nevertheless, I think the trajectory of this line is pretty clear over the last 20 years, that despite a huge investment from the industry in R&D, the productivity and the number of drugs that are being produced and are coming out of the industry are certainly far from where we would like the industry productivity to be at. I think one of the challenges that we recognized a few years ago was really that the landscape is comprised of various disparate groups of individual players, whether that's big pharma, interfacing in some way with biotech, sometimes more successfully than others, the academic community, that focus in the ivory tower on the purity of science, and yet arguably one of the main institutions where new ideas emerge from. The venture world, I think we're still at a very exciting time, and certainly being based in Boston, I think there's a really interesting way that the venture community has worked both with pharma, biotech, and to some degree with the academic community. And then patient foundations, I think these have become increasingly important. I think we're fully aware of the success of foundations like the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation. But I think if we're living in this era of drug discovery and translation and patient stratification, enabling patient trials, then that is an important role, I believe, of patient foundations, patient advocacy groups to play in this new emerging ecosystem. I think this is one of the most exciting trends in the industry that we're seeing over the last several years, is that these disparate groups of individual players are now starting at least to work together in a more holistic system, one that's based on collaboration, one that's based on the appreciation that to develop a new type of impactful therapeutic, we've got to find more creative vehicles, built in different business and legal frameworks to allow various sectors within this new ecosystem to be able to work together and collaborate, and one by which we hope it creates value. Value for pharma, value for academia, and ultimately we hope value and valuable new therapeutics moving into patients in diseases of high unmet medical need. So several years back, we reflected, and of course, when you sit in an organization as large as Pfizer, we really wanted to build a group within Pfizer that would be disruptive internally in terms of how we thought about innovation and how we accessed new ideas. And it was interesting to reflect on this manuscript that now was published back in 2010. And certainly I found this data a little bit of a surprise. This was a review looking at 252 new drugs that were approved by the FDA between 1998 and 2007. So again, the data is a little bit out of date, but I'm sure if the same type of analysis is done more recently, the trend would be very, very similar. And you can see here in the red bars, around about 50% of the drugs that were approved by the agency during this time period had their home either in academia or in the biotech community. So at Pfizer, we started to reflect, how can we access, how can we partner with such a large sector of innovators where this is a source of at least 50% of the new drugs that get into the market? How can we find a different way to interact with the academic community? One that's less contractual, one that's less based on writing those large checks, I think that Big Pharma used to do some years ago. One that was really built on building a true collaborative model that had incentives for both pharma and the academic players to collaborate and work together. Looking at some of this data also is really quite fascinating. The R&D budget in Pfizer is some $6-7 billion a year. I wish our CEO would make that a few $1 billion more. But nevertheless, when you look at the NIH funding, over $30 billion, clearly, it's still never enough money for everything that I think we'd like to do in the academic setting. But when one starts to look at where the key hubs are for NIH-funded academic institutions, you'll see the top 10 NIH-funded institutions are discretely located in a number of geographical regions. The Northeast, Mid-Atlantic, and over on the West Coast in California and Washington states. Moving to the top 20, then we see other states, North Carolina, for example, UNC being one of the 12, 13 NIH-funded institutions. And on the other side of the graph, you'll see where the funding is aggregated by geographic region. And again, of course, the Boston, New York, Mid-Atlantic area, Philadelphia, Washington, D.C. stands out, and clearly San Francisco and San Diego as the major biotech hubs. So 3-4 years back, bearing in mind where a lot of the NIH funding is going, we took, I think, the bold step to take people out of Pfizer and embed them in these 4 major academic institutions. So we've built teams in Boston. We're located there over in the Longwood community, next to Beth Israel Children's across the street from Harvard. We have 2 labs over in California, one on the Mission Bay campus, right across the street from UCSF, and a group there right next to UCSD in La Jolla, and a group down in New York City on 29th and 1st Street, for those of you who spend a little bit of time in New York, right next to NYU. So let's get people who understand drug discovery. Let's put them in these 4 major centers where we believe there's great basic translational and clinical stage research. And let's get people who really understand drug discovery talking to the academic community. And we put together a framework by which now we have almost 30 academic institutions that have partnered with CTI, institutions as diverse as UCSF, working with our group there in Mission Bay, institutions and private institutions like Rockefeller, working with a group in New York City, as well as groups, of course, in Boston from MGH, Children's, Harvard, and so on. So this gives us, I think, a really unique access to literally thousands of investigators in basic science and translational science and clinicians who would like to be part of a true drug discovery project. And over the last several years, we've had the opportunity to review probably close to 1,000+ different proposals that have been submitted. And we've been able to build teams that are comprised of individuals from my organization, from the broader Pfizer group, as well as from the academic institution. And these teams work on a single problem, solve a single problem to identify and develop new candidate therapeutics that together we translate into the clinic. And that's really the scope of CTI. I think in some ways that's why it's attracted the attention of many individuals within the academic sector, in that it's not just basic research, it's not just more mouse models, as important as they are. It's can we work together, create an idea, create a concept, and move that into the clinic together. I've mentioned some of the patient foundations that we work with, now 6 different foundations, and I'll talk a few words about those in a slide or two. And at the end of last year, I think we signed a really exciting agreement. Although I often do joke, bringing together the government and Pfizer is kind of a scary prospect. But nevertheless, we've signed our participation agreement with the NIH, and that gives us access to all 27 institutes and centers within the intramural program, including the clinic that's on the Bethesda campus. So that's been really exciting to be able to work with literally hundreds of investigators and try and find those right opportunities that are ready for drug discovery, that together with investigators down in Bethesda, we can move into the clinic together. So that's what we think about our new drug discovery ecosystem. I think we've recognized in Pfizer, we can't do it alone, and I think we've built the right framework, we've built the right type of model to allow us to work with the various different groups represented on this slide. I think I've said many of the points on this slide already, so if we look back again at where the major hotspots are for biomedical R&D, at least in the US, that's where we've put our scientists. But of course, we do realize there's great science that happens outside New York, Boston, San Francisco, and San Diego. And we're now building a more virtual model, working with a number of institutions in Australia with Monash University, University of Melbourne, University of Queensland, more recently with a number of institutions in South Korea. And I guess my home country there is probably too small to see, but through some interesting unique partnerships both in the UK as well as in the Republic of Ireland. I thought this data may be just interesting to share as well to give you some idea of the potential of this large collaborative network. These are our 26 US institutions that over the last 5 years have been part of the CGI network. And you'll see there the cumulative growth in access to NIH funds as we brought in new academic institutions. So close to $9 billion in funding from the federal government to those 25, 26 institutions. So again, from the perspective of sitting in large pharma, which of course traditionally has been very, very insular, we can now open our drug discovery know-how and work with a number of key basic scientists and clinicians that really have access to a significant amount of government funding. So some 4 or 5 years later, this is a group that we've established. We started CTI as a department of one person with a very large whiteboard and some ideas about how we could really accelerate and translate innovation to the clinic. And now we're a group of about 100 people, with probably another 300 people in Pfizer, in the medicinal chemistry organization, in antibody engineering, pharmaceutical science, regulatory supporting my team, working with probably about 300, 400 individuals in the academic network that I've mentioned. And that really is a focus, again, is acceleration of new ideas into the clinic. And it always, causes me to pause and just reflect on, some really important new therapeutics that we've seen over the last 2 or 3 years with inhibitors of CTLA-4 and PD-1. And for those immunologists in the room, you may remember it's probably almost 30 years ago now since the cloning of CTLA-4 and describing CTLA-4 as a negative regulator of T-cell activation. And yet 25 plus years from that initial observation to go from understanding a little bit more about the basic biology to developing a therapeutic. So really our challenge and mission, and maybe the challenge back to everybody in the audience today, is how can we accelerate those new discoveries? And can we actually reduce the time from that initial observation from 25 years down to 15? Could we do this even in 10 years if we formed a different type of team and had a very, very different way of thinking about innovation translation through this partnership model? And of course, like all of us in the room, it's working together to deliver therapies that make differences in many patients' lives. So maybe just get into a little bit more detail about what CTI is and something equally importantly, what it is not. So it's translational. It's a group that's focused on translational biology. So it is the development of those candidate drugs that we jointly own and jointly share with our academic partners. But it's working with the clinical sites, the clinical teams that we've established to really ask meaningful questions in the right patient population. So certainly we're not designed to run large trials of 250, 300 patients, but can we run a small trial in 25, 30 patients to look for some type of mechanistic signal that supported the hypothesis that excited us about the biology in the first place? As you can imagine, by building an agreement that's been signed by so many institutions, we've had many, many lawyers in many institutions reviewing the agreements. I think we've built a model that is fair, we've built a model that's transparent, we've built a model that creates value for both the individuals and teams that we've established. We are totally agnostic about therapeutic area. I should say we started off focused primarily on biologics, so maybe not too much of a surprise that most of the opportunities and most of the candidates and most of the clinical trials that we're starting are in the inflammation, immunology, cancer space, with some opportunities there in the rare disease space. But now we've extended the initial focus on biologics to small molecules. And I think we're seeing some pretty exciting new ideas in the cardiovascular disease space, and probably more importantly in neurodegeneration, working with, I think, some very, very significant leading scientists across the CTI network. The funding mechanism is also important. We consider ourselves to be a little bit more VC-like, in that while the agreement we have with many of these institutions are 5 years in duration, we fund based on continued success of where the science is going to. And I think people are very familiar with a number of recent reports that 50, 60, 70% of data coming out of academic institutions cannot be reproduced. Certainly by having teams of scientists working side by side, I think we've been able to work through some of those, at least perceived, real or not, challenges of data coming out from academic institutions. But nevertheless, if the science doesn't quite work out as one had anticipated, we're able to shift our resources, dollars, time, people to projects that have more likelihood of meeting successful milestones and moving into the clinic. So I think I can go through this slide quite quickly, as I've probably said many of these points already. Co-location, we think it's important. We don't think it's the only way to build these partnerships, but at least by having scientists embedded in key academic hubs, we think that creates a unique model and certainly does foster collaboration and interaction. Being able to work in biologics and small molecules, of course, gives us great opportunities to follow the science. And having this CTI participation network in place, this agreement in place, means we do not have to negotiate each time we see a new exciting opportunity, that everything's been pre-negotiated, where the IP has been agreed up front, where there's reversion rights if the project doesn't move forward, where the milestones and royalty payments are agreed even before we start the project. So why would this be interesting to anybody, of course, in the academic community? Well, I think there are a growing number of basic scientists who, in fact, may have spent most of their career curing cancer in mice or curing diabetes in mice, but would love to be part of a true drug discovery translational program. And of course, what we can bring to bear to this is our drug discovery capabilities, not just to develop molecules that look like drugs, but in fact be able to provide teams and regulatory support to meet the so-called valley of death, so that in fact when an idea gets to a lead molecule or a candidate stage, we can use our understanding of how can we move these new potential therapeutics into the clinic and do that in a faster way. Partnering with patient foundations, I think this is hugely important. We've been able to pull in and have 6 patient foundations sign, again, the very similar agreement that we have with our academic institutions. So we work very closely with the Juvenile Diabetes Research Foundation, the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation of America, with the Sarcoidosis Foundation, the Alzheimer's Drug Discovery Foundation, the Alliance for Lupus Research, and more recently, in a meeting I was at last week, with the Jeffrey Modell Foundation, a foundation focused on primary immunodeficiencies. And these foundations bring an awful lot to the table. Certainly they bring some financial support, and many of the programs that we have in CTI that fall into type 1 diabetes, into rare diseases, into lupus, into Crohn's disease, are in part funded by our foundation partners. But probably more importantly, they help us to have that patient-centric view. As we're moving into the clinic now in inflammatory bowel disease and in a number of rare cancers, by working with some of these institutions, they're really able to help us with patient enrollment. And they know everybody within the academic community. So we're able to identify individuals that we may not have been able to partner with if it hadn't been for our relationship with some of these foundation groups. So we can bring to bear to many of our academic partners, or indeed all of our academic partners, large teams of 10, 15 medicinal chemists as we advance some of our small molecule programs. Antibody discovery, we have, like I'm sure many people in the room today, a sophisticated antibody engineering pharmaceutical science organization that can make high-quality antibodies, antibody-drug conjugates, and do that relatively quickly. And for each of the teams that we establish, we'll have a toxicologist on the team, we'll have pharmacologists, we'll have regulatory support. So it really does form a very, very interesting complementary single team with that unique and sole focus of advancing that idea again from the bench into the clinic afterwards. So I think I'll just show the last two slides as a brief summary of what I've said. Thousands of ideas have been submitted. We have run 50, 60 projects. We're in 4 locations and bringing together, I think, really exciting teams that help us to build what I see as quite a unique pipeline. It's a very novel pipeline. Of course, innovation comes with a high degree of risk and attrition. But I think we've been able to develop some new drugs and find some new ideas and advance those new ideas, often before those new concepts are even published in the literature. And that's, I think has been really, really exciting for us. So with that, I'll leave. This is my last slide. With, I think, the words here that sum up many of the thoughts that we have, certainly in CTI. It only takes one innovation to make a difference in many patients' lives. So thank you so much for your attention. Certainly happy to answer any questions that you may have. Thank you.